Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We're going to start here momentarily. The title for today's webinar, Out of Sight, Not Out of Mind, How State and Federal Funds Can Address Challenges of COVID-19 and Wildfire Displacement in California Rural Schools. We're glad you joined us during your lunch hour. We know this is a really busy time of the year for many of you as we wrap up the school year, but we're honored to have you join us. And we have an esteemed panel joining us virtually today. Next slide, please. So from UCLA, Mary-Louise Leger, Gabby Corona Valencia. Both Mary-Louise and Gabby are doctoral researchers at UCLA in the Center for the Transformation of Schools. You're going to hear from Rindy DeVoll, who's the MTSS Director for Rural California and the California Rural Ed Network Director. Rindy also plays a critical role at Butte County in the Student Programs and Educational Support Division in the Butte County Office of Ed. And Butte County is a co-lead with us as part of California MTSS with multi-tiered system of support with Orange County Department of Education. You're going to hear from Rindy, and then we're going to go to Stephen Hom. Steve is I'm going to say Steve now. Mr. Hom is a school climate and culture specialist for Mendocino County Office of Education. After Mr. Hom, you're going to hear from Dr. Blanca Baltazar Sabah. And Blanca is an assistant superintendent in Salinas Union High School District. And then we're going to jump into Q&A, but really the focal point or kind of the impetus for this conversation is this really powerful brief that Mary-Louise and Gabby developed, shaped by perspectives of a number of rural ed leaders in California, including Rindy DeVoll. Thank you, Rindy. But we're going to jump into this brief as really a starting point to have honestly an overdue conversation, which does happen in rural communities every day, but sometimes doesn't happen in the state of California. So we're going to talk briefly about the demographics or characteristics of rural communities in California. Mary-Louise and Gabby are going to get into an overview of the policy brief itself. Rindy DeVoll is going to connect all this work to the California MTSS framework and what it means for rural schools. Then we're going to hear from Mendocino County and Steve. We're going to jump to a district perspective from Blanca, from Dr. Baltazar Sabah, and then we're going to get to Q&A, which would be about 15 minutes. I should have introduced myself. My name is Joe Bishop. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for the Transformation of Schools at UCLA. Our faculty directors are Dr. Tyrone Howard and Dr. Lucrecia Santibanez. And we are excited to just host today's webinar and jump into the conversation. Now, going back, if you wouldn't mind, Geneva, going back to the title really quick. Thank you so much. And Geneva Sum has organized today's webinar as our communications director. I want to acknowledge Geneva for her leadership today. But as we think about some topics, COVID-19, wildfire displacement, these are topics that have impacted us all in different ways over the last few years in particular. So I just want to acknowledge that the conversation we might have or that we will have might bring up emotions and might trigger some of you on the call in different ways. And want to acknowledge that this is an important conversation, but it's not a lighthearted one. So just want to raise that now before we jump in. This is not just a conversation. We're talking about people's lives every day, and in particular in rural communities in California. So I just wanted to start with that context. Geneva, if we could go to the next slide. Geneva, I know we have some housekeeping things to keep in mind.
Yeah, so just a few quick things. So first of all, this webinar is being recorded, and we will share the recording as well as the slide deck in a follow-up email. And just a reminder that if you have any questions that come up during the webinar, we have a Q&A box that is the best place to put those questions, and our team here can try and sort of answer them, type out answers live, and then we'll also have time at the end to do some verbal answering of those questions as well. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A and not in the chat box, because if they go into the chat, then we might overlook them. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Thanks, Geneva. So jumping in here to the context in which we're having today's conversation. So there are three framing questions which could be a day-long conversation if we chose to make them so. So what are the characteristics of the communities we serve? And you're going to hear this specifically from our leaders today on the call and our experts. Number two, what have we learned as a school system during the pandemic and as wildfires in California have become more common for rural communities? The last question, what new ideas and models are being brought to the table that can support more equitable educational experiences for young people and families being served in geographically isolated communities? So our panel is going to answer these questions in different ways. By no means, panel, are you restricted to answer all these questions, but these are kind of the overarching themes for today based on the really important work of Mary-Louise and Gabby in pulling together this brief. Next slide, please. Thank you, Geneva. Okay, so context. I think a big takeaway for this work for our team is that we need better data on educational outcomes for students in rural communities. As a state, this is something that we can work towards. But as context, in 2018, this is the most recent national report, we find that in California specifically, majority of our students served are still in urban settings, approximately 4.4%, as you see in yellow, are in rural settings. That equates more recently into about, after declining enrollment, to about a little over 500,000 students that are served in rural communities across California. And as we look at the United States as a whole includes more rural communities, but really California is still a rural state. And I think a lot of folks lose that context because we are such a massive state that we all are in our own counties, our own cities, our own geography. So we lose sight of the fact that California to a large degree is still a rural state. So just to keep that in mind. Next slide, please. And as we think about the characteristics of our student body, so according to the most recent data posted on the CDE, there are 5.8 million students enrolled in California's public schools, majority of whom are Latino, number one, and two are socioeconomically disadvantaged or coming from low-income families. So just to keep that context in mind, a majority of young people, again, are young people of color coming from low-income families across California. That pattern in terms of income plays out across the three communities highlighted today: Butte County, Mendocino, and Salinas, in which, again, a majority of students, vast majority of students are coming from low-income families. And as we look at Butte County, you're going to hear from Rindy DeVoll, but majority of students are white. And then as we look at Mendocino, we see more of a bimodal population in terms of white and Latinx. That's also changing in Butte, but to a large degree, Mendocino is bimodal, and Salinas majority Latino community at 91%. So the racial, ethnic, and social characteristics of the communities that are in which experts are going to be joining you is just an important context to keep in mind. With that, let's jump in and hear from Mary-Louise Leger and Gabby Corona Valencia.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Gabriela Corona Valencia, and I'm so excited to be in community with all of you today. I am currently a PhD candidate and doctoral student instructor in the School of Education and Information Studies at UCLA. Before going into the solutions provided in this report, I think it is essential to know more about this brief's development. As a doctoral researcher for the Center for the Transformation of Schools, I had the opportunity to support the California Multi-Tier Systems of Support, MTSS, statewide initiative. In this position, I had the pleasure of crossing paths with rural state leader Rindy DeVoll, who is here today. Hey, Rindy. When Rindy and I would meet, she would passionately voice the urgency of reimagining and upholding a more sustainable restorative justice model exclusive to the rural communities of California. This is an essential conversation to carry through because of the various unique challenges that rural communities face, such as digital divisions for students in rural schools compared to students in schools in urban areas, COVID-19 vaccination hesitancies, lack of community health supports, school staffing challenges, and increasingly frequent and destructive wildfires. With this awareness, I joined conversations centered on creating solutions for the challenges during the first MTSS pilot year in 2020, before the COVID-19 closures, when former MTSS director, Dr. Kai Matthews, and I traveled to rural California communities to gain a better understanding of the rural education landscape. Reading about rural education is one thing, but visiting the communities and seeing the challenges firsthand illuminates the resilience of students and educators in rural school systems. During site visits, we engaged with numerous teachers, counselors, superintendents, principals, and students who demonstrated astronomical cultural wealth and were innovatively attempting to build an ecosystem that supported rural students and family-specific needs. After grappling with the data from the first pilot study, our MTSS collective wanted to move forward in carrying a conversation by offering a set of possible solutions for rural education challenges. One critical need is to expand our notion of school safety in rural schools. For example, preventative measures for rural California communities could include ventilated buildings for healthier air quality, support for community risk reduction and adaptation planning, risk integration of forest management into state climate and biodiversity programs, and enhanced protection for wildfire-prone communities. Often people think of school safety as metal detectors and increased surveillance systems, but in rural communities, increasing safety measures means creating sustainable infrastructures that build confidence and intellectual curiosity in students. Other solutions in our brief include fostering educator pipelines through residency programs, which research has proven the effectiveness in recruiting and retaining teachers and overcoming geographic isolation, competitive compensation for educators, credentialing support, suggestions on bridging the digital divide, the benefits of widespread implementation of community schools. I hope you will all find this brief helpful in community efforts to bring educational equity to rural California education systems. Thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to hearing the rest of what our amazing collective has to say.
All right, and I will take it off next. A warm welcome to those who are joining us from all over. I apologize for any background noise that you may hear. Not too long before this meeting, my internet began to give me problems, forcing me to run to the closest coffee shop. So I am sweaty and I'm competing with the sound of an espresso machine behind me. But it's a kind of a fitting introduction to some of the issues that we'll be talking about today, like bandwidth instability and the rural barriers to access. My co-author Gabby, she's a hard act to follow, but I'm going to do my best, and I'd like to do that by talking a little bit about what precipitated this brief. In the midst of COVID and virtual learning and that onset that happened in 2020, which simultaneously feels forever ago and like it was yesterday, Gabby and I got to talking, and what we thought was, a lot about the underrepresentedness of the rural educational experience, where challenges of COVID and virtual learning felt magnified. By underrepresentedness, I'm really talking about the lack of representation in both media coverage and research. I mean, I felt like everybody was talking about the Great Resignation, but in rural contexts, the loss of human capital in schools is more difficult to fill. Issues like bandwidth and less dense health and social infrastructure, these issues just compounded. And I think that one example of that just feels really fundamental to well-being is the way that COVID and rampant wildfires interacted to create higher rates of asthma while simultaneously less access to medical care. Something as simple and as human as breathing was threatened. And still, most media coverage and research wasn't talking about it. Yet, I think if we had spent the entire time talking about challenges, we'd just be another group of people gap gazing and problem raising. And I think there's another story. And I think we presented it in the brief, and which we really would like to uplift here at this webinar. And that's the story of possibility and of potential and of these really powerful opportunities for transformation. Gabby's raised some of those, and I'll add to her list. We have grow your own approaches to teacher credentialing, building community schools, and fostering really vibrant partnerships. And all of these can be funded by federal and state funds. We discussed those in the brief, but what I hope to do now is turn it over to some of our diverse rural leader and voices and experiences, and to use the rest of our time to center our webinar on those. Thank you so much. My name is Mary-Louise, and I'll kick it over to our next participant.
Unmute. Great. Thank you so much, Mary-Louise. It's so nice to be here. It's my pleasure to be with all of you today. To give you some context about my role, the two hats that I wear in my position at the Butte County Office of Education include being a member on the statewide executive team for California Multi-Tiered System of Support, like Dr. Bishop said, as well as leading the California Rural Ed Network. So our California MTSS executive team includes our colleagues here with us today from the Center for Transforming Schools at UCLA, plus some of you in the audience and others, as well as the Orange County Department of Education. So that's the California MTSS side. The California Rural Ed Network includes our BCOE executive team of 3, along with a steering committee, an advisory council, a group of researchers from various counties, and 260 plus members from across California. As a rural advocate, I was honored and energized to support Gabby and Mary-Louise in their efforts to shine a light on rural education and the need for equity in the system as it relates to rural education. This policy brief provides a timely inspection of the challenges and promising practices for our rural schools and communities across California. My recommendation to you today is to take the information from this that connects with you and to leverage a local conversation with whomever you think needs to hear it. If you've chosen education as your career, then you know a lot about our dynamic, complex system, which aims to serve all students and families from the high desert of Modoc County to the sand dunes in Imperial County, over to the coast, the beautiful coast in Mendocino County as well. For rural educators, we are in great need for a customized approach for receiving funding, implementing relevant programs, and sustaining those practices that are most effective for our rural students, families, and communities. In the next few minutes, I'd like to bring your attention to some of the specific challenges illustrated in the brief, and then I intend to implant some, hope to implant some ideas about how to move forward in a more equitable way. The digital divide, as Mary-Louise spoke about, or what I call a lack of access and connectivity for our rural communities and schools, became a top news story during the beginning phase of the pandemic. Rural schools, as we know, so many of you were involved in this, quickly shifted to distance learning with the resources that they had, which were already lacking. Teachers worked desperately to engage students on virtual platforms while being booted off the network every few minutes in some cases. We heard stories of teachers driving to their students' remote homes to support their learning. School buses became hotspots, set up in graveled parking lots, and they also delivered lunches to homes up long dirt roads. Local markets and hardware stores provided spaces for students to complete their lessons. The collective response from the rural community members was above and beyond, and frankly, a part of the human fiber in rural areas, in my experience, and living in very rural in the last 3 to 4 years. So we also have to talk about the impact of the wildfires and the impact that they've had on our communities and schools. The shared experiences among our rural counties like Shasta, Lake, Mendocino, El Dorado, and of course Butte include numerous displaced families, infrastructure devastation, and trauma at all levels. There's a lot of load on each person's plate, along with the expectation to somehow keep going. Suicide and addiction are among the most difficult leftovers from the fires to manage. Teachers and administrators are fleeing the field in many areas. We can't stop the train of education, but some of our tanks are just empty. However, if we're going to talk about trauma, we must also include resilience. The sheer strengths, the innovations, and the creativity that has emerged from our communities is fascinating, to say the least. As we pick up the pieces together and literally rebuild our communities, there is hope and promise. According to our very own amazing education technology team at BCOE, local teachers are now experts in Google Classroom and Kahoot. Custodians, cafeteria staff, and yard duty supervisors could have doctorates in social emotional learning. Superintendents, who may also be principals and teachers very often, are finding their job-alike colleagues and making connections with other rural leaders to expand their leadership and their dedication to their staff. Resilience has an important place. In conclusion, I want to implant those ideas that California MTSS implementation as an approach to align everything in a school system. When our rural schools embrace California MTSS, they report stories about how valuable it is to be able to assemble the necessary structures to serve their students, staff, and families in a customized way. The flexibility of the framework allows school teams to design learning and collaboration with the freedom to do it their way. And that's a rural cultural factor, is that we love a little bit of help, but we also like to do things our own way. So the California Rural Ed Network was developed to be an on-ramp for California MTSS. Our partners in the beginning knew that they needed us to bridge the language and service for our rural colleagues. The California Rural Ed Network is continuing to respond to the unique needs of our members through communities of practice, tailored professional learning opportunities, and simply opening the virtual doors for those seeking answers and connections to the few and far between folks that serve our students and families in rural areas. Thank you for this opportunity for me to amplify our voices in rural education. And I look forward to engaging in more discussion about questions you have about California MTSS and or the California Rural Ed Network, and ways that we can help each other out and start building those bridges and connections. Thank you so much. And I think I'm going to turn it over to the next speaker. I believe so, right? My friend and colleague, Steve Hom. Take it away.
Thanks, Rindy. Hey everyone, welcome. My name is Stephen Hom and I work in Mendocino County as a school climate coach. And it was funny when we were preparing for this, just thinking about the task of describing my 20+ years living in Mendocino County, a complex place, and telling you a whole story in 7 minutes. So this is going to be a sliver of a much more complicated picture. So, Geneva, if you could advance, I have a couple of images I want to show everybody. I didn't know how to characterize or describe Mendocino County, but I thought about those questions. And so this is the information I decided to share with you, not what you usually expect to see. So I'll give you a second to take a look at it. We have a pretty small population, less than 100,000. And then I looked at the square miles, it's something like 5,000, but then that becomes meaningless to me. Just know that it's mostly trees. And our student enrollment is about 12,000, a little higher. And we're really centered in 3 areas, Ukiah, Willits, and Fort Bragg. Ukiah is, I think, 15,000 in town, and then the areas around maybe 30. And Ukiah and Willits are a little bit smaller, about 10. But they account for 3/4 of the population. So that means another 3,000 kids. Students are sort of scattered among those trees I described. We have 4 Caltrans maintained roads, 101, 1 on the coast, 20, and 128. And I guess maybe 162 as well. But and it's about an hour drive for those outlying communities to get to one of the 3 cities, a grocery store like Safeway, or a hospital. And these are definitely considerations people make. You know, on the weekend I have to go to the grocery store, or I cut my finger, now I have to drive an hour, those kinds of things. So just to get a sense of rural. Can we move to the next slide, please? So again, just a sliver. We were talking about pandemic and wildfires and things like that. So the image that I found on the right was, I was curious about internet connectivity, and we basically have cable. We have 1 fiber optic cable that comes to our county. And during the pandemic, there were 7 districts with very limited internet access. You can see all the stars are our 12 districts. So the response, as Rindy mentioned, was hotspots and Chromebook maintenance. And just a recent conversation last week with one of those stars in the red was that there wasn't actually enough Chromebooks for all the students. And then, so there was purchasing of them, and then how are they going to maintain them? Because middle school students break Chromebooks pretty frequently. So I would say outcomes from something like that, I often say, and I don't know if this is a good or bad thing, but crisis breeds innovation. And so that crisis kind of forced people to come together in different ways. So now there's a little bit of infrastructure, and systems can flex and adjust a lot more. So we have weather issues, floods, too much rain, and then schools close. And for a couple of years, we were losing school days. You know, we'd have 175 or 178 days, and we'd have a waiver, you know, districts to sort of forgive us for those missed days. We had smoke days because of fires or evacuation needs. So one of the outcomes, or some of the outcomes, were now schools plan those into their calendars. So if they have a smoke day they don't need, they just tack it on to the end of the year, that kind of thing, to make sure those 180 days happen. And definitely, as Rindy mentioned, school staff needed to modernize. And that's not to throw any shade or a dig at the hardworking staff here in Mendocino, but like you said, having to learn Google Classroom and how to use Screencastify and all that kind of stuff was a big lift. But now, if students need to go home for 2 or 3 days for smoke, we don't have to stop learning. We can just pivot. And that's a huge innovation that came out of crisis. So that was pretty cool. And then schools, not that they were never not centers, but they were redefined definitely in other ways. They were information centers for so many different questions. So that was kind of neat to see as well. A few other innovations to mention that aren't here. Like Rindy said, even like HVAC systems have been updated, or I think it was Gabby about safety. So that's something that's happening across the county too. So it's like universally, it's benefiting everyone. Environment improvements, playgrounds, playground equipment, picnic tables, all these kinds of infrastructure things are being improved because of, so it's not to say, yay, pandemic, but things came out of it that were helpful. Okay, and then to the last slide, please. So then the last question was, how are we addressing equity? And again, one sliver, past mental models are being explored. So the most popular question always is why, from a 2-year-old to if you're 86. But definitely students came back to school saying, like, why do I have to do this? Why do I have to sit in desks? Why do I have to sit in rows? Why do I have to be here for 50 minutes? Parents are asking and staff are asking of their leaders too. So instead of being vague and broad, just bring it home with a story of homework. There's a high school in our county that was kind of exploring their own beliefs and core values around education and kind of redefining a vision. And so the question came up, well, what are we going to do about homework? And it was brought up that, you know, that's the way we were brought up in school, that homework was what a good school did. But then having done a 1.5 years of distance learning and seeing kind of coming a little bit closer into the homes of students, realizing, you know, not everybody's house is the same for doing homework. So trying to set up ways in schools to support independent learning, and not even calling it homework, but independent practice, I guess. So that's just one story of that change. So not necessarily working harder, but just working differently, finding out different ways to meet needs. Small towns, we may have less grocery stores and hospitals are further away, but there's less degrees of separation to call up the sheriff or the district attorney or the head of social services. In fact, we have a collaborative that's working that involves the DA, social services, police department, public defender, and school board to address mental health needs, like tier 3 intensive mental health needs of students and adults in the community. That didn't exist before. So different kinds of relationships are coming or forging. Last thing, the best tool is people are less afraid of the difficult conversations. Although they are scary and we want to be cautious of them, we don't avoid them, we just jump in and have them anyway, whatever that might be. And it's different for every school, what their difficult issue is. But that's been our best tool this year, is master facilitators to guide difficult conversations. And that's all. Thank you.
Mr. Hom, I want to thank you for your comments and for, if you just joined us, just to connect the dots for you. So you first heard from Mary-Louise Leger and Gabriela G, Valencia, the 2 co-authors of this brief, why they did the work kind of the urgency of the report as a way to bring a lot of ideas together. You heard from Rindy, DeVoll, from a statewide perspective, unique needs and challenges of rural communities, but also the resilient and powerful partnerships that are coming together. And you just heard more of that from Steve Hom about how Mendocino is working across agencies, across nonprofits, across communities in ways that have never, honestly, have not happened before. Maybe there's a new interest in connecting the school to the community and that vision for readiness. And but now we're going to hear from, last but not least, Dr. Blanca Baltazar Sabah, Associate Superintendent from Salinas, to bring it all together at the school, at the district level, and then we'll get to Q&A.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bishop, and I'm honored to be here among this distinguished panel. A little bit of context about Salinas. You heard earlier about our demographics. I'll just add that Salinas is known as the salad bowl because of our large ag industry. We have strawberries along with tomatoes and spinach and lettuce, which are major crops. We have a large labor workforce. We have one of the highest proportion populations of Latinos in Salinas. I think my co-panelists have done a great job of sharing the challenges. I think what I will add is that when I read the brief, I was really struck by just how right on it was with relationship to the challenges that included the digital divide, the staffing shortages, the need for increasing mental health services. And so what I hope to offer today is share a little bit about what we learned as a result of the challenges that we faced the last 2 years. And I think first and foremost, similar to my colleagues, that we learned that we can be flexible, whether it's a wildfire or a COVID surge in the middle of the year. Like, we've been able to adapt and transition to spaces to support our students. And I think that we were reminded of the opportunity, of the importance of building relationships with government agencies and community organizations, because when a crisis happens, it's all hands on deck, right? And everybody has to come together to support the community. One of our mottos was, stronger together. So when we're doing things together, we're just gonna come out of this. And resiliency was definitely, it was amazing to see our students and our families just come together. Our staff who were frontline workers, nutrition services, our administrators, our teachers, everybody just coming together and being really super resilient. And also what we learned was we saw that the inequities that already existed were really exacerbated because of the pandemic, and especially in our most oppressed communities. And as Steve mentioned, we knew that we're hubs of the community, but I don't think we realized how important those were, especially when it came to food security. And as mentioned, having to think about how do we provide meals to our students who don't have access to transportation to get to us because of where they live, and having to coordinate bus transportation to take food to them. And so I think really thinking about what have we been missing when this wasn't happening? How did we make sure that all of our students were having access to food? And lastly, we were fortunate enough that prior to the pandemic, we had already begun the work of mental health services to our students. So we had to transition to virtual therapy sessions. But what came from it, one thing that we learned is that when we were in person, we were providing therapeutic services to our students. And as a result of being in distance learning, we now had the opportunity to engage the families in those services. So it became services not only for the students, but for the families, because trauma not only impacts the individual, but the entire community. And what we've seen is an increase in stress, depression, frustrations, and grief, stemming from closure of schools, loss of jobs and wages, death of loved ones, and just the prolonged uncertainty caused by COVID. And we also actually had some wildfires nearby last year, which is not typical for our area. And that just kind of added to the trauma. So as a result of what we've learned, what we are trying and attempting to do that's innovative is really with the community schools grant money, with the state money that is being offered, we're looking at expanding our wraparound services at our wellness centers. Currently, we offer academic, behavioral, and social emotional supports, but with a community school, we're looking at expanding to medical, dental, and food resources that the community needs. Currently, we've partnered with a local hospital and a clinic to have mobile clinics at 2 of our school sites. And the data is impressive in terms of the number of our families and students accessing that medical care that they would typically not access, whether it was because they didn't have transportation, they just didn't know how to access. Many of our families do not have health care, they don't have insurance, they don't know how to access Medi-Cal or Medicare. And so having the mobile clinics on our sites has been a tremendous service. And I think with the other component of this is the staff shortages, and in the brief, it mentioned that this is definitely an area, and I will just restate what was in the brief as a solution with the residency programs. Those have been key for us in increasing the number of math and science and teachers with special education credentials that we've partnered with universities to have those residency programs. And every year we increase with different grants that are available to ensure that we're trying to keep that pipeline coming as a result of the difference. And I will end with the last thing that we learned and that we're working towards is improving our SEL for adults, because we need to make sure that our adults are regulated so that our students can be regulated. And the last 2 years, there's been a lot of trauma. And so really increasing our services for the adults that we work with to ensure that they're in a place and space to be able to be where they need to be when they're with our students, because we are a community and everything that we do impacts one another. So I will close with that, and I'm happy to transition to Dr. Bishop, and thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I look forward to answering any other questions you may have for me.
Thank you, Dr. Baltazar Sabah. And as a great example, talking about making connections to the medical field, even how you're thinking about community school funds at the state and federal level. So, and something I should have started with about a half hour ago is it is Teacher Appreciation Week. And the week in which we're having this conversation, and just want to thank the educators, not only on our panel, but joining us virtually for all that you do for our young people in our state. Sometimes your work is quite thankless, and I know as a dad of boys in public school, it has been quite a few years. But and I think in particular, if you are an educator in a rural community, you are asked to do just about everything every day, and without you, we don't have a public education system. So just want to thank you all for everything. And I want to transition back, actually going back to Mr. Hom and Ms. DeVoll, a question around, so we talked about, so today's conversation is framed around how do we leverage state and federal resources. I wonder if we heard a little bit from Dr. Baltazar Sabah about how Salinas is thinking about state funds and focusing on student and staff mental health support in particular. Curious for Butte and Mendocino, what are you thinking about it, to steal Blanca's language, and all hands on deck approach when we think about leveraging in particular federal funds, and how are you kind of working in different ways now to maybe help inform other communities who are kind of grappling with, okay, we have this resurgence, we have these new funds, but how do we make the most of them if they are one-time funds? So I'm curious, how are you thinking about that as a county? I know, Rindy, you can put on the statewide hat too. So Steve and Rindy, if you'd like to answer. I know that was a long-winded question, but
That's
hopefully
okay.
it was semi-clear.
I can respond from a sort of, and I know some of my colleagues on here from Butte County Office of Ed would have more extensive answers, but from what I've learned since Camp Fire in 2018, November of 2018, we were able to just have so many resources brought into our county, mental health supports with therapists and licensed professionals that really helped to start the healing process. And then we had, I think it was a 2 to 3 year sort of phase for that. And unfortunately or fortunately, that brought 2020 and the pandemic. And so those resources that we had in place and still helping the communities of Butte County to heal were resurged. I think there was some refreshed resources brought in and almost expanded as I think about some of my newer colleagues that have just come on to continue with that. And so the shifting from what happens, with a campfire disaster and all of that healing to the extra load of COVID-19, I'm really appreciative and know that our county received extensive support. Unfortunately, that's not even across the state when we hear some of our other colleagues in other counties. Not sure of that structure, the funding structure and the financial help. But I think with this new community schools money and some more mental health monies that are coming from state and federal, those will help to sustain that the circles of healing that are happening, individual therapy to group therapy to all kinds of mental health support. But I do want to say, yes, it is a challenge, and we're very fortunate to have that. I think of our colleagues in Plumas County that just recently went through the fire, and Shasta County, also some of those more northern, further up north counties. What I do know is that our superintendents have gotten together to share their experiences. So when the campfire happened, I know that we looked to Sonoma County, to their county office of ed, to help us with what they were, what they had done. And so we have actually implemented structures and plans, strategic plans on how to respond to all of that. So hopefully that answers that question.
Thanks, Rindy. No, definitely. Thank you so much.
To respond as well from Mendocino County, just jotted a few things down. So specifically, I think lifting out things like mental health first aid, there's been a lot more interest in that regionally. Also, it's a big challenge. And I was just talking to some board members the other day from our larger district about how do we spend this huge amount of money that we have. And what they've said was, we need a vision statement. We need some sort of way to kind of guide us, in these times, to say, this is our values again. This is what we're about. This is what we want to spend money or put resources to. And then the third part, I think this goes back to what Dr. Baltazar said about adult SEL. What I noticed at schools is adults are really, not that they never did before, but kind of explicitly owning, I need to be the calm when kids are looking for someone to tell them how to feel about a situation. Like, how should I feel about what's going on now? How should I feel about if it is a fire? How should I feel about the changes in our rules because of the pandemic? How should I? So strengthening the adults who then be the pillars of regulation for kids. That's another area people are exploring.
Thank you, Steve. So I see two questions from Kevin Osorno, and one question for Dr. Sabah from Yao Qiang Lu. Let me go. So on average, how many, the first question was, I think we might have to do some digging. This might be a get back to you in a follow-up email. On average, how many days in the year are lost due to rain, floods, and fires? I think that probably really depends, but I don't know if anybody has an immediate answer to that. And the second question is around peer-to-peer communications in rural schools. What have been some of the challenges in conducting peer-to-peer communications? I'm aware there have been new regs around Title V that require this. Would like to know if there are any ways rural schools have been help with peer-to-peer communication. And then there's a question around shortages. So we'll just get to all of them. Could you please detail the problem? Is there a staff shortage in most of rural districts in California? So let's go to Kevin's questions again around lost days and peer-to-peer, and then we'll get more to shortages. Who would like to take the first question around lost days? And maybe we need a new conversation on lost days too, even in this current context.
I would say this year has been a year where our districts have really built in, literally they're calling them like smoke days or extra, days. But in the last couple 5 years or 6 years, again, as you said, this isn't like hard fact, but it feels like it's probably between 2 and 5 or 6 days a year kind of get lost, depending on, in 2017, when there was a fire here in Mendocino County, it was probably more than that. But smoke days, I think when Paradise had their fire, we shut our schools down for a couple of days because of that. So that's to that response. I'd say it's between 2 and 5 or 6, it seems.
Thank you, Steve. And on the peer-to-peer, unique challenges around peer-to-peer communications.
From a statewide perspective, I can take that one. The challenge just in the experience when we were initially implementing MTSS across the state, we tried an experiment in Butte County with our Hill schools, we call them the Hill schools, 3 single school districts, to bring them together in a collaboration, because that is the challenge. And unfortunately, it was in a scientific experiment, it fell apart. And we're still sort of looking at that. We thought bringing together, kindergarten through 2nd grade teachers, 3rd through 5th grade teachers, 6th through 8th grade teachers together, because they're singletons. They never get to really collaborate and engage in conversations at professional learnings at the same level that other urban and suburban teachers do. We thought that would be great. And we're still sort of examining where was a lack of motivation. And I don't want to pinpoint any sort of responsibility on anybody, but it was that there's a culture that is still worth examining about that. Those in-person sort of collaborations or just peer-to-peer communication like Kevin's talking about. One solution we have, though, through the California Rural Ed Network is we've been able to provide a community of practice for multi-grade teachers across mostly the Mid-Valley, or Central Valley of California, and a couple of teachers from Trinity County virtually. So because we have become more versed virtually, we're able to run this community of practice. And I want to put that out there also to anybody who's interested in, we can become the facilitators. Like we say, we just open the doors and let you come in and talk. So if somebody needs support in that from a rural community, I'm more than happy to help facilitate that, at least in the beginning, until somebody can get it running and build that capacity. But for sure, it's a very essential thing to have peer-to-peer communication. So every month the teachers report, it's so nice just to hear somebody that has my life as a kindergarten through 2nd grade teacher, right? That whole multi-grade area is very unique. There are very few out there, and they need to talk to each other. So thanks for that question, Kevin.
Dr. Sabah, thank you, Rindy. Dr. Sabah, if you could answer actually 2 questions around the wellness center. So we have so not only around staff shortages, if you could be a little more detailed, what those shortages look like in your district, but a question from Siskiyou. We have a wellness center providing social emotional learning for parents, teachers, and students. We would also like to expand to include health services. Dr. Sabah, what funding sources are available to sustain and expand? What advice or information can you suggest for us? That was from Arden Carr. Thank you, Arden, from Weed and Siskiyou.
So I Rindy might be able to tell you more about statewide if this is a staffing shortage. I would assume it is. I can share that the staff shortage is a couple of reasons. We've had a lot of early retirements due to just the last 2 years and the stress. We've also we do not have enough teachers in the pipeline, and so we in our own district we have a CTE pathway for education that then links up to the community college, the university, but we still don't have enough students, and many of our students actually want to go the elementary route, and we elementary teachers, and we're secondary, so we're middle school and high school. So we're having a difficult time finding teachers. This year, we had vacancies at the beginning of the year. We had to actually pull our teachers on special assignment from their assignment to go back into the classroom. And then on our classified staff, we have many vacancies. So while it's a blessing to get all these one-time monies for specifically, where they're restricted, where they want us to add more staffing, we put it in the budget and then it sits there because we can't hire the people that we would like to have because there just isn't, they're not there. And so we have many vacancies in the classified, from paraeducators to campus supervision to nutrition services in every category. And so that's our reality. And Rindy, I don't know if you'd like to add from a state perspective, you're seeing the same thing.
Thank you. Yeah, just in staff shortage, when we think of all the specialized positions, right? Psychologists, excuse me, psychologists, physics teachers, science physics teachers, right? Those are those unique positions that really just don't exist. Speech therapists, those all of those things that aren't, your typical language arts or math teachers. Those are the things that we're seeing mostly shortage. And this is based on an informal survey that we did just a couple of months ago about what are your biggest challenges right now. So that's what that came from.
And also school nurses, we haven't been able to replace. So what we end up having to do is contract out with different organizations. To add to the question about the wellness centers, so what we've done is we've partnered with the local hospital, one of our local hospitals and one of the clinics, and they have grants that they can apply for. So we kind of co-author the proposal, and so we become a partner with them. And so actually it doesn't cost the district any money to have them at our sites and have them provide the services, because they're providing the medical services. However, when it comes to the other funds that we use for the wellness centers, we use our supplemental concentration money that comes from the state. We've been able, through the ESSER funds, these one-time funds, been able to increase the number of social workers we have, the number of psychologists we have. So we've utilized the federal funding, the supplemental concentration, and then we partner with our community agencies for grants, so it's really, what's the terminology? The braid funding, right? And so it's really about getting creative and looking at various ways and we're looking at how do we sustain it throughout time. But it seems like right now, there are many grants that are supporting access to healthcare and partnerships with schools. So it's promising, and I just hope that state legislators kind of continue that and transition from the one-time funds to ongoing funds so that we can continue with these services.
So that's a great segue to our close here. We're going to go around one last time to everybody, but these issues are bigger than one-time funds, right? Bigger than one-time solutions. And the all hands on deck approach is something that defines rural California, but now it's become a really something that's more common across the education field. So let's go from our last presenter to the first presenters, Dr. Baltasar Sabah, Mr. Ham, Ms. DeVoll, and let's end with Mary-Louise and Gabby to close us out, and then I'll wrap it up. But if you could share very briefly, what's one thing that sticks out to you from this conversation? Maybe it's something that you're very clear about before you came in, or maybe it's more clear, but what's that one thing you want to share, or maybe even a quick word of inspiration for other colleagues on the call right now?
I'll keep it short. Relationships matter, and we have to continue to build our relationships with each other so that we can support each other, because we are stronger together.
I love that. Yeah, I'm like 100% signing up for that belief and philosophy. I think the thing that I forgot to mention from the brief was I also love the idea of the homegrown talent. I know you're calling it something different, but there's definitely different pockets of that, not as organized as the CTE. So that's super cool too. Good idea.
Great. Thanks, Steve. I think before everybody came on, Steve recognized Gabby, who had come through their research in the beginning of our phase 2 California MTSS, that she traveled to Fort Bragg, Mendocino County, to talk to teachers and other staff members about the implementation of California MTSS. And this was another piece of this really informal survey that we did a couple of months ago. And over and over and over again, the folks said, come see us, come see us, come and see who we are. So I appreciate that so much, Gabriela, that you were able to go and see and really know and Fort Bragg and feel the community, and your love for it is really nice. And I get it, because I do too. I love it. So that's the message from our rural administrators and teachers. Just come and see what we do. We can't tell you, we don't have time. You need to come and see us, and then you'll fall in love with us, and we'll have these great relationships. So thanks.
Gabby, I'll get us started. I think one of the things that I'm left with really is, I think a lot of the innovation and insight exists. I think it's about passing the mic and giving the money to make that insight and innovation a reality more systemically in our rural areas.
Thank you so much. And I am very grateful to be in community with just amazing rural state leaders. I'm educators, and everything has just been a privilege to be able to engage in your space. And it's just been a very amazing ride. And so when it comes down to shifting the possibilities for rural communities, everything worthwhile is done in community. And I think this has been the most collaborative, collective a feel that I've gotten from doing anything in my PhD program over the past couple of years. So I really appreciate this opportunity, and I look forward to supporting any ideas, any shifts that we're trying to make happen for justice for our rural community. So thank you, everyone. This was great being in community, and I look forward to seeing what happens next.
Absolutely, and thank you again, Mary-Louise and Gabby, for pulling together this really important brief. And thank you to our expert panel, really, for your honesty, humility, and just the way you think about your work. It's much bigger than work. And I'm going to actually hand it over to Geneva on the next steps. Thanks, Geneva.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Bishop. So just follow-up items to wrap us up here. We will send out a follow-up email to everyone that registered and attended that will contain a link to the recording of this, as well as this slide deck and a link to the policy brief, so you can get a chance to read through it. And just a reminder to make sure you're signed up for the CTS email list. And we do a lot of events like this throughout the year, and we'd love to see you at the next webinar. So if you sign up for the mailing list, then you'll get information about upcoming events. And then all of the links that I mentioned are in this deck as well. So here's a link to the policy brief. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great rest of the afternoon.